The fluorescent lights of St. Michael's Hospital hummed their mechanical song as Ashley Cooper arrived at 6:48 a.m., badge clipped to her scrubs, coffee steam rising from a paper cup she'd picked up at the corner bodega on Military Highway. She moved through the ER hallway with the kind of posture that belonged in a formation, not a hospital, shoulders back, spine straight, feet landing with precision. The burn unit called. She knew this without being told. Something about the way the charge nurse's radio chatter had shifted at 6:15 a.m., the urgency in the background, the specific request for an ICU bed. She'd learned to read the hospital's pulse the same way she'd learned to read a combat zone's pressure changes, not from obvious signs, but from the space between them. Her locker was in the back corner where nobody noticed it, where she could be alone for exactly 90 seconds every shift. Inside, hanging from a hook behind her spare shoes, sat a folded flag. Tri-fold. Crisp. The kind of precise fold that only military hands could make. It had belonged to Sergeant James Halloway, Weapons Sergeant, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, Dark Horse Company. He'd been 24. She'd held his hand for the last 4 minutes of his life in Ramadi while his blood soaked through her tourniquets, while her voice stayed steady in his ear even though her hands were shaking inside her gloves, shaking with rage, not fear. Rage was information. Pain was data. Grief was a luxury she couldn't afford until the mission was over. The flag came home. He didn't. It was the only proof left that he'd been real, that any of it had been real. Ashley closed the locker without looking at it again and turned toward the ICU. The admission paperwork sat on the charge nurse's desk, a male patient, 42 years old, admitted at 4:33 a.m. with extensive thermal injuries covering 70% of his body. Burns from a warehouse fire on Brambleton Avenue. No identification on him. No wallet, no phone, no family contacts listed. The paperwork said John Doe in the name field because that's what they called them when nobody came looking. But someone had come looking once. Someone had marked him. Ashley's jaw tightened the moment she saw the name on the chart, admitted patient Cooper. Not the nurse. The patient. There was another Cooper in this hospital now. She found him in bed 7, ICU bay, surrounded by the architecture of survival, ventilator hissing its mechanical rhythm, for lines snaking from both arms, a central line disappearing into his chest. Burns wrapped in silver sulfadiazine gauze. His face was swollen beyond recognition, his right arm extended and immobile. She approached slowly. The chart said his vitals had stabilized at 3:11 a.m. Stable was a relative term with thermal injuries this extensive. One infection, one pneumonia, one aspiration event and he'd be gone. The human body was a fragile thing. She'd learned that at 23 in a combat hospital in Kandahar. She'd learned it again at 26 in an operating room outside Fallujah. She'd learned it every day since. But it was his left forearm that made her pause. There, in faded black ink, was a tattoo. A name. Her name. Cooper. Just that. No first name, no rank insignia, no unit patch. Just Cooper in capital letters that had begun to blur and blur again from the scarring of thermal damage. She'd seen the tattoo before. She remembered the moment he'd gotten it, remembered the story behind it, remembered why soldiers carried names on their skin like prayers. Her hands remained perfectly steady as she pulled up his chart on the bedside computer, scanning his vitals, his medication list, his burn surface area calculations. No tremor. No sharp breath. No visible reaction. The burn unit had him scheduled for the first debridement in 4 hours. His prognosis was listed as guarded. That was hospital language for probably dying. The monitors beat their electronic pulse while Ashley documented his fluid intake and output with obsessive precision. Every milliliter counted. Every infusion rate mattered. The Parkland formula for milliliters per kilogram of body weight per percentage of burn meant this man needed 8.4 liters of fluid in the first 8 hours just to keep his organs perfusing. She calculated it twice. Then again. The charting was perfect, the medication times exact to the minute, the documentation so thorough it would survive any audit, any investigation, any scrutiny. Military habit. Attention to detail had kept soldiers alive. Attention to detail was the difference between being believed and being dismissed. She was still charting at the ICU desk when Dr. Mercer arrived. His shoes clicked on the tile floor before she heard anything else. Italian leather. $300 dress shoes that screamed money in a hospital that paid nurses $26 an hour. He moved through the ICU with the kind of confidence that came from never being questioned, never being challenged, never being held accountable for anything. His presence made the air pressure change, like a storm front moving through a valley. He carried a tablet under one arm and a coffee from the hospital cafeteria in his other hand, the expensive kind, from the specialty cart that cost $7 a cup. He passed 3 critical patients and didn't look at any of them. He stopped at the ICU desk. Looked at the charts. Looked at Ashley's documentation with narrowed eyes. "This charting," he said, his voice like machinery running cold. "John Doe, right? Extensive burns?" Ashley didn't look up from her computer. 70% TBSA. Admitted for 33 a.m. from Brambleton warehouse fire. The documentation here, Mercer continued, his tone shifting into something sharper. Every drug time. Every vital sign. Every fluid rate. This is meticulous. That's the standard, Ashley said quietly. She still didn't look up. Her fingers kept moving across the keyboard, charting the lab values from the burn unit's last assessment, sodium levels, potassium, albumin, everything the body was losing through burned tissue. "Yes," Mercer said. He was standing closer now. She could smell his cologne, expensive and cloying, mixed with the coffee. Standard. That's one way to describe it. He paused. Though some might call it obsessive. You know what happens with obsessive documentation? People start noticing patterns. People start asking questions. He smiled. Not everyone's paperwork holds up to that kind of scrutiny. Ashley's hands didn't pause. Her breathing didn't change. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. She'd been trained to recognize threats in 0.3 seconds. She'd been trained to assess lethality. She'd been trained to move in response before her conscious mind caught up. This man standing 3 feet away with his designer shoes and his warning barely concealed, was a threat of a different kind. Not a physical one. Not yet. All patients deserve meticulous documentation, Ashley said. Her voice was quiet, deferential, the voice of someone who knew her place and stayed in it. Especially the ones who can't speak for themselves. Mercer made a sound that might have been a laugh. Right. Of course. He set his coffee down on the ICU desk, right next to her keyboard, a gesture that meant something. Well, you keep up that wonderful attention to detail. Keep documenting everything. Every procedure. Every medication. Every billing code. He paused. I'm sure nothing unusual will ever turn up. He walked away. His shoes clicked on the tile. The coffee he'd left behind was still steaming. Ashley didn't touch it. She didn't look at him. She returned to her charting, the cursor blinking in the medication field, her fingers steady as surgical instruments. Mercer had just made a mistake. He'd shown her his hand. He was worried about something in his documentation. Something that meticulous charting might expose. He was worried about her. The next words out of his mouth would matter. She could feel it coming. She finished the ICU charting and moved back to bed 7, the one with Cooper tattooed on his left forearm. The burns were so extensive she couldn't read anything beneath them except the name. Just the name. His face was still swollen, still unrecognizable, but his left hand, the one without the fall line, was moving slightly. Micro-movements. Muscle memory. Maybe even consciousness somewhere beneath the morphine and the shock and the trauma. She placed her hand on his unburned shoulder, just for a moment. A human touch. The contact lasted exactly 2 seconds. His eyes opened. Not all the way. Just a crack. Just enough to see the iris, the pupil, the faint spark of recognition that might have been reflex or might have been something deeper. His mouth moved. His burned lips struggled to form something. A word. A breath. She leaned closer, close enough to hear him whisper against the ventilator's hiss. One word, Phoenix. Ashley's face remained a mask of professional neutrality, but inside her chest, something shifted. Phoenix. That was a code name. That was a call sign she hadn't heard in 4 years. That was a voice from a war that officially never happened, from an operation in Ramadi that had been erased from every military record the moment it went sideways. Only 3 people knew that code name. One of them was dead. One of them was somewhere in the Pentagon, hopefully still running black operations. And one of them was standing right here, wearing scrubs and holding a stethoscope, moving through a hospital like she was just another nurse keeping her head down. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that Mercer was making a phone call. She could hear him from the other end of the ICU, his voice low and clipped and filled with something that sounded like urgency mixed with barely controlled panic. His phone was pressed to his ear, his free hand gesturing sharply even though whoever was on the other end couldn't see him. "We have a problem," he said into the phone. "Her name is Cooper. She works nursing here at St. Michael's. And she just noticed something." Grand rounds began at 7:13 a.m. in the conference room on the 3rd floor, the kind of fluorescent-lit space where reputations were built or dismantled in front of an audience. 23 residents and attending physicians sat in ascending rows like stadium seating, clipboards balanced on laps, coffee cooling in paper cups. Dr. Mercer stood at the podium, his tailored blazer catching the light, his voice carrying the particular contempt of a man who'd never been questioned by anyone who mattered. He clicked the remote. Ashley's charting appeared on the projection screen, magnified to enormous size. Her handwriting, precise and methodical, filled the digital canvas. Every vital sign documented. Every medication verified. Every patient interaction recorded with the kind of meticulous detail that came from training where lives hung on accuracy. "This," Dr. Mercer announced, his voice dripping with theatrical disgust, "is what happens when we lower our standards." The residents shifted, sensing blood in the water. One of them, a 3rd-year named Collins, smirked and whispered something to the resident beside him. The whisper was loud enough to carry, quota higher. "Nurse Cooper apparently believes we have unlimited time to compose novellas instead of progress notes," Dr. Mercer continued, red circles appearing on the screen, highlighting Ashley's documentation as though it were evidence of incompetence rather than mastery. "At St. Michael's, we value efficiency. Not verbose documentation that clutters our electronic systems." Ashley sat 3 rows from the back, her posture perfect, her hands folded. Her jaw tightened imperceptibly, just a hairline clench that would have been invisible to anyone not trained to read restraint. Her breathing remained even. Controlled. Her face became a mask of professional neutrality, the kind of composed expression that came from 18 months of practice in hostile environments where showing emotion meant showing weakness. Another slide appeared. Then another. Each one of her charts, each one meticulously organized, each one now presented as evidence of her fundamental inadequacy in front of people whose respect she was still building. The residents behind their clipboards exchanged glances. One of them, a 4th-year resident with the kind of jaw structure that suggested his family had been sending him to elite institutions for 4 generations, actually rolled his eyes. "Perhaps at military hospitals," Dr. Mercer said, and here his voice became almost conversational, almost sympathetic, "standards were different. Perhaps they had all the time in the world for bedside manner and documentation that reads like a novel. But here at St. Michael's, we have a different philosophy." Ashley didn't blink. Didn't shift. Her nails, short and practical, pressed crescents into her palms, but her hands remained hidden below the desk where no one could see. The pain was information. Pain was a reminder that she could endure what she was enduring because she had endured far worse. The presentation lasted 17 more minutes. Later, at 1:34 p.m., Ashley stood in front of the vending machine outside the cafeteria, retrieving her granola bar. The machine hummed with mechanical indifference, the afternoon light slanting through the hospital windows in long, geometric patterns. She'd chosen this time deliberately, the shift change, when most staff rotated through the break room and disappeared. She'd miscalculated who would still be lingering. Dr. Mercer appeared at her left shoulder, close enough that she could smell the coffee on his breath, the particular bitterness of it mixing with expensive cologne. His presence had the weight of deliberate intrusion, a violation of space conducted with absolute confidence that no one would object. "You know, Cooper," he said, his voice pitched for only her to hear, "I've been thinking about your career trajectory." Ashley retrieved her granola bar, her movements deliberate and unhurried. She turned to face him, her expression perfectly neutral, her eyes meeting his for exactly 2 seconds before she looked past him. "You might actually be more comfortable at a less prestigious facility," he continued, and now his hand moved to the shoulder of Dale, the security guard standing near the beverage station. Dale was 6'2", solid, with the bearing of someone who'd worked corrections before he'd taken the hospital security position. Portsmouth community is always hiring. They have a very different philosophy about expectations. His hand remained on Dale's shoulder, a meaningful gesture that transformed the security guard into a prop, a visual punctuation mark meant to convey implied threat wrapped in administrative courtesy. "Dale here used to work at Southampton Correctional. He's very good at helping people understand when it's time to move on." Dr. Mercer smiled, and his smile was the smile of a man who'd never faced consequences, who'd learned early that cruelty wrapped in civility was indistinguishable from professionalism in institutional settings. Ashley unwrapped her granola bar. Her hands were completely steady. Her face betrayed nothing. She had dismantled roadside bombs with less composure available to her than she maintained standing 3 feet from Dr. Mercer's invasive proximity and his performance of power. "I appreciate the suggestion, Dr. Mercer," she said, her voice level and quiet, the voice of someone whose certainty was so complete it needed no volume to establish itself. 10 words, no more. "I'm staying." She walked past him toward the exit. Dale shifted, and his shift was subtle, just a micro-repositioning that he probably thought was imperceptible. It was the shift of someone who'd been given permission to enforce a boundary, who'd been transformed from security personnel into an instrument of institutional will. Ashley walked past him like he was furniture. That evening, at 8:13 p.m., she stood alone in the staff bathroom on the 4th floor. The fluorescent lights buzzed with that particular electrical hum that most people tuned out automatically. She gripped the porcelain sink with both hands, her knuckles whitening. Her jaw worked, the muscles at her temples visible, her teeth clenched hard enough to feel the pressure of her own bite. The mask cracked only when no one was watching. Her eyes squeezed shut. Her breathing became something deeper, something that moved through her like a shudder, but still controlled, still disciplined, still the breathing of someone who understood that losing composure was a luxury that people in her position could never afford. The mirror reflected back her face, jaw tight, eyes closed, the image of someone holding themselves together with the same precision that had held her together through 18 months of deployments where showing weakness meant something worse than humiliation. She released the sink. Opened her eyes. Ran cold water. Splashed her face. Dried it with paper towels. The mask reformed itself, perfect and seamless, indistinguishable from the professional composure that had carried her through grand rounds and hallway intimidation and the particular knowledge that her meticulous charting, the very thing Dr. Mercer had mocked, was the documentation that would eventually destroy him. Because Ashley's charts weren't verbose. They were forensic. By 4:56 p.m. the next afternoon, Dr. Mercer received her shift reports. The documentation was so precise it was almost architectural in its construction, every procedure coded, every medication documented, every interaction recorded with a kind of detail that suggested either obsessive diligence or someone building a case. Her notes on the cardiovascular patients he'd coded as requiring intervention were accompanied by parameters that seemed almost normal when you glanced at them casually. But if anyone examined them closely enough, if anyone actually pulled the imaging studies and the blood work and cross-referenced her documentation against the procedures he'd authorized, they would see the pattern. Unnecessary. Profitable. coordinated in a way that was too consistent to be coincidental. Dr. Mercer skimmed the reports and felt something cold move through him, not fear yet, but the first faint edge of it, like a predator suddenly recognizing that the thing it was stalking might have its own teeth. He set the reports aside and made a phone call. "Martin, it's Thomas Mercer." His voice was different now, not the confident drawl he'd used in the hallway, but something tighter, more urgent. "We may have a situation developing. There's a nurse, Cooper, Ashley Cooper, who I believe is becoming a problem." The voice on the other end was inaudible, but Martin Whitmore, the hospital's chief financial officer, would later claim he heard concern, not confidence, in those words. "I'll need to accelerate some things," Dr. Mercer continued. "Can you have someone from your network available? I think we may need to initiate the protocol we discussed for problematic employees." He hung up and looked at her reports again. Somewhere in his chest, something that had felt like certainty began to feel like a ticking clock. And then, on a Tuesday at 2:17 p.m., the waiting room held 32 people. Families with sick children. Elderly patients waiting for results. A teenager with a skateboard injury sitting between his anxious parents. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical lullaby. The receptionist at the triage desk was processing paperwork, her voice soft as she checked in a patient with a persistent cough. The double doors to the emergency department exploded inward with a sound like a car crash. A massive figure filled the entrance, 6'5", shoulders like a linebacker, his frame so large he seemed to shrink the space around him simply by occupying it. Former patient Marcus Webb. He'd been discharged 3 weeks ago against medical advice, his psychiatric hold lifted after 72 hours of observation that the insurance company had determined was sufficient. The .45 automatic gripped in his right hand was steady, his eyes wild and unfocused, the kind of eyes that belonged to someone whose interior landscape had become completely hostile. "Where is he?" Marcus roared, and the roar had the quality of something animal, something that bypassed civilization entirely. "Where is Dr. Mercer?" The gun swung toward the triage desk. Screaming erupted instantly, not the theatrical move-aversion screaming but the primal sound of immediate mortal threat. Chairs toppled. A mother threw herself over her 2 children, her body becoming a shield. The elderly patient scattered with surprising speed. The teenager abandoned his skateboard and dove toward his parents. The waiting room transformed in 4 seconds from a place of routine care into a landscape of pure panic. The triage nurse dropped behind her desk. Security guard Dale, positioned near the waiting room entrance, reached for his radio and froze. His hand hovered for exactly 1 second before his survival instinct overrode his training. He backed toward the stairwell door, his eyes on Marcus's gun, his body making the calculation that this situation was beyond his job description. Dr. Mercer, crossing through the waiting room on his way to surgery, went white. The color simply drained from his face like someone had turned a valve. He flattened himself against the hallway wall, then retreated through the staff entrance, his expensive shoes slapping against the tile floor as he moved toward the secure areas, toward the parts of the hospital that could be locked. The waiting room became pure chaos, 30 people trying to force themselves through 2 side exits simultaneously, a human stampede of terror. Someone's phone fell and shattered. Someone else was crying. A man in a wheelchair tried to propel himself toward the exit and tipped sideways, his wife pulling at him, both of them trapped in the mathematics of confined space and overwhelming panic. Marcus fired once into the ceiling. The shot was deafening in the enclosed space, a percussion that silenced even the screaming for 1 awful second, then amplified it. Plaster rained down like snow. The fluorescent light above Marcus flickered and died. His breathing came in gasps, his chest heaving, his lips already taking on a faint blue tint. Ashley Cooper was at the pharmacy window, 3 doors down the main corridor, when she heard the shot. She was holding a tray of medication bottles, verifying counts against a shift report. Her hands went still. Her eyes moved up from the tray. Through the interior glass window, she could see the scene in the waiting room. She could see the massive figure. She could see the gun. She could see 30 people scrambling in terror. She could see Dale backing away. She could see, in the split-second clarity that comes from combat training, exactly what was about to happen if someone didn't intervene. She set down her medication tray. The movement was deliberate. Careful. Like she was setting down something fragile instead of something important. She moved toward the pharmacy door, opened it, and walked directly into the waiting room. Her hands were visible, raised to shoulder height, empty and open. Her footsteps were measured. Measured like someone walking through familiar space, not like someone approaching a threat that had just fired a bullet into a ceiling. "Marcus," she said. Her voice cut through the chaos with the precision of a blade, the same voice she'd used on shell-shocked soldiers in Ramadi, the voice of someone who understood that the most dangerous moment was the moment after violence had been introduced and before the person committing it understood that violence had consequences beyond them. "I need you to look at me." Marcus turned toward her, his breathing labored and rapid, his chest heaving with the kind of distress that spoke of something compromised in his respiratory system. His lips were darker now, deeper blue, the color of oxygen deprivation beginning its work. The gun swung toward her. The gun swung toward her. Ashley didn't flinch. She didn't step back. She moved forward instead, each step deliberate, her hands visible and open at her sides like she was approaching a terrified animal instead of a 6'5" man with a .45 caliber weapon and nothing left to lose. Marcus Webb's pupils were blown wide, his breathing coming in sharp gasps that rattled in his chest like he was trying to suck air through a collapsed straw. His shirt was soaked through with sweat despite the waiting room being cool enough to see breath. The gun wavered in his grip, not from weakness, Ashley noted, but from something else. Hypoxia. Confusion. The early stages of shock. Behind her, the waiting room had transformed into organized chaos. 32 people. A mother with a feverish toddler on her hip sprinting toward the exit. An elderly man in a wheelchair being abandoned by his grandson. Screams echoing off linoleum. The automatic doors sliding open and closed like a mechanical heartbeat trying to digest the panic flooding outward. Security personnel were shouting into radios, their voices crackling with codes Ashley recognized from her time waiting in forward operating bases, active threat, all personnel, lockdown protocol. But Ashley was moving against the current. Everyone else was running away from Marcus Webb. Ashley was walking toward him. "You're having trouble breathing, aren't you?" Her voice was calm, conversational, the same tone she'd used with shell-shocked Marines in Ramadi whose nervous systems had been scrambled by IED concussions. "Your chest hurts on the right side." Marcus's eyes locked onto hers. The gun hand wavered. "How did you?" "Because I've seen this before." She was 10 feet away now. The gun was still raised, but his arm was shaking, not from fear, but from oxygen deprivation making his muscles unreliable. Ashley kept her hands visible, kept her body language open and non-threatening, even as her peripheral vision tracked the weapon angle, the distance to his wrist, the exact moment his hypoxia would make him lose consciousness. "You're not crazy. Your body is fighting you. That's all this is." His breathing came in gasps now, each one more desperate than the last. The blue tint that had started at his lips was spreading outward, creeping into his fingernails. His neck veins were distended like ropes beneath his skin, jugular venous distension, the classic sign of tension building in his chest cavity, his right lung collapsing under pressure like a balloon being crushed by invisible hands. Asymmetric chest rise. Tracheal deviation. Every textbook sign of a tension pneumothorax, and Marcus didn't even know his own body was killing him. "Because I've seen this before," Ashley repeated. "You need to sit down right now, Marcus. Your body is fighting you, but you can stop fighting back." The gun lowered another inch. Muscle memory, she thought. The same way a drowning man stops thrashing when someone tells him to trust them. Marcus stumbled backward until his legs found the plastic waiting room chair, and he collapsed into it like his strings had been cut. The gun dropped toward his lap, his hand falling open. They wouldn't help me." His words came in gasps between desperate attempts to breathe. "Sent me away, said I was broken, wouldn't even look at me." Ashley moved closer, her knees bending until she was eye level with him, her gaze locked on his face. She'd done this before in Ramadi with a young lance corporal whose best friend had been liquefied by a drone strike. The same techniques worked whether you were in a forward operating base or a Norfolk hospital waiting room. Keep them talking. Keep them present. Keep them connected to something human. "I'm going to help you right now," Ashley said. Her voice had dropped an octave, not threatening, but authoritative in a way that made Marcus's eyes focus on her instead of the spiral of despair in his own mind. "But I need you to put the gun down so I can use both hands. Can you do that for me?" For minutes. That's how long it took. For minutes from the moment Marcus walked through those doors until the weapon clattered onto the linoleum floor next to his shoe, his hand trembling as he released it like he was surrendering the last piece of himself. Ashley was already calling for supplies before security even approached. "I need a 14-gauge needle decompression kit. Second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. Now." Her voice was clinical now, stripped of the therapeutic warmth she'd used for de-escalation. This was different. This was command. A nurse Ashley had never spoken to appeared with the kit. No questions. No hesitation. Just a woman in scrubs recognizing someone who knew what they were doing. Marcus's shirt came off. His chest was pale, his ribs visible beneath skin stretched tight as a drum. Ashley's hands moved on their own, muscle memory from casualty care training, from field surgical procedures, from the kind of medical interventions that happened in sandstorms and helicopter rotors instead of sterile operating rooms. She located the landmarks with her fingers. Second rib. Midclavicular line. The exact spot where the collapse was happening. The needle went in. There was a sound, the hiss of air escaping, compressed air rushing out of the space between his lungs and his ribcage where it had no business being. The sound of pressure releasing. The sound of a body getting a second chance. Marcus gasped like he was surfacing from deep water. His color improved in seconds. The desperation in his eyes shifted to confusion, then to something that looked almost like gratitude mixed with shame. From the hallway, watching through the glass partition between the waiting room and the main corridor, Dr. Mercer stood motionless. His jaw was tight. His hands were curled into fists at his sides. Ashley could feel his gaze on her back like heat from a furnace, and she knew exactly what he was seeing, not a panicked nurse, not a frightened woman overwhelmed by a crisis. He was seeing someone move with absolute certainty. Someone who'd performed emergency procedures in far worse conditions than a hospital waiting room. Someone whose hands had held lives together in places where there was no backup, no code team, no safety net. Someone dangerous. The paramedics arrived within minutes. As they loaded Marcus onto the stretcher and began their own assessment, confirming the needle decompression, stabilizing him for transport to the ICU, Ashley stood and stepped back, allowing the emergency system to take over. She was peeling off her gloves when she heard the stairwell door slam 2 corridors over. Dr. Mercer. Already moving. Already making calls. She didn't have to wait long to find out what he decided to do. The hospital administrator, Linda Chen, appeared 20 minutes later with 2 security personnel flanking her like reluctant pallbearers. Her face had the particular expression of someone who'd been instructed to do something she fundamentally disagreed with but lacked the power to refuse. "Ashley, I need you to come with me," Linda said quietly. "We need to discuss what happened in the waiting room." The security desk was on the main floor near the lobby. Ashley had walked past it hundreds of times during her months at St. Michael's, watching other people surrender their credentials for reasons that ranged from administrative leave to termination to arrest. She'd never imagined it would be her turn. She'd been so careful. So methodical. So invisible. "Pending the investigation, we're going to need your badge and access card," Linda continued, her voice carrying the exhausted tone of someone reading from a script someone else had written. "Dr. Mercer has filed a formal complaint with the State Board of Nursing regarding unauthorized medical procedures performed outside your scope of practice. He's also initiated a peer review process and contacted our legal team about potential liability." The badge went into a manila envelope. The access card followed. Ashley watched them disappear into a drawer like they were pieces of evidence at a crime scene. Behind her, somewhere in the stairwell or his office or already on the phone with board members, Dr. Mercer was executing his contingency plan with the kind of precision she'd normally have respected if it wasn't designed to destroy her. She had performed emergency needle decompression to save a man's life. Dr. Mercer was turning it into an accusation of recklessness. He would argue that a registered nurse had exceeded her scope of practice. That she'd acted without physician authorization. That her actions, however effective, violated hospital protocol and state licensing regulations. He was probably already on the phone with Jim Reeves at the state licensing board. Probably already had his private investigator digging into gaps in her employment history, those 5 years that were just missing from any official record because the military didn't acknowledge Black Ops personnel in standard databases. The evening had already begun its slide into darkness when Ashley pushed through the hospital doors and stepped into the Norfolk air. The parking lot was cool, the asphalt still wet from afternoon rain that had fallen while she was talking Marcus Webb down from a ledge he'd been standing on for months. She sat in her truck with the engine off, hands resting on the steering wheel, and allowed herself the smallest acknowledgement of what had just happened. She'd saved someone's life. And in doing so, she'd given Dr. Mercer the exact opening he needed to move from tactical harassment to active sabotage. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that every second of this was exactly what she'd been trained for. Every decision. Every moment of composure. Every time she'd refused to break or cry or show vulnerability in front of people who wanted her gone. This was what it felt like when the past started catching up. His lips were turning blue. Ashley noticed it first, the subtle shade shift at the edges of Marcus Webb's mouth, the kind of color change that took less than 2 seconds to spot if you'd spent 3 years watching soldiers' faces during shock progression. His breathing had changed too. Shallower. The kind of breathing that meant his right lung was collapsing in on itself, air trapped in the pleural space with nowhere to go, pressure building against his heart with every failed breath. Tension pneumothorax. A ticking clock inside his chest. She was still kneeling in front of him, her hands visible and empty, her voice the same low register she'd used on shell-shocked Marines, no urgency, no panic, just steady calibration. Marcus, I need you to stay with me. You're having trouble breathing because it got trapped in your chest when you hit the ground. I can fix that. I need your permission. He nodded, his head moving in small jerks, his eyes starting to glaze with the particular terror of suffocation. Around them, the waiting room had gone silent. Security guards stood frozen at the exits. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like angry wasps, and somewhere down the corridor, a monitor beeped its steady rhythm, the sound of the hospital continuing its work, indifferent to the fact that a man was dying 3 feet from the vending machine. Ashley didn't ask for help. There was no time for protocol or authorization or waiting for Dr. Mercer to swagger in and take control. She moved, and her hands moved with her, muscle memory taking over, the kind of physical knowledge that lives in tendons and bone marrow, deeper than thought. She found the trauma shears in her scrub pocket, the one she kept sharp enough to cut leather, and cut a 4-inch strip from his shirt. Her fingers located the landmarks without hesitation, second intercostal space, midclavicular line. Right side. She could feel the anatomical geography under her fingertips the way a map reader feels a highway, every reference point exact. The needle was 14-gauge angiocath, the kind that came in the emergency crash cart that she'd watched a resident bring and then abandon when the panic started. She'd grabbed it on instinct. Now she held it perpendicular to his chest, angled slightly caudal, and pressed in with controlled pressure. The resistance of tissue. The sudden give as the needle pierced the pleural membrane. The hiss of air. It wasn't loud, just the sound of pressure equalizing, of a man's lung being allowed to re-expand, of physics and anatomy and decades of training happening in the span of 3 seconds. She could hear the oxygen saturation rising before she even left the waiting room, the body's chemistry shifting from crisis mode back toward something that might be survivable. His color began to return, pink replacing blue like someone was turning up the saturation on a digital photograph. His breathing deepened. His eyes refocused. "You're going to be okay," she said quietly. "You did good. You stayed calm." That was the moment Dr. Mercer appeared in the waiting room entrance, his face still carrying the expression of a man about to celebrate a victory that had just evaporated in real time. He watched Ashley secure the angiocath with tape, watched her take Marcus Webb's vitals with the competence of someone who'd done this under mortar fire, watched a crisis resolve that had no business resolving without a trauma surgeon and a level 1 operating room. She helped Marcus to his feet and guided him to a stretcher, her hand on his back, her voice steady and clear. "You're going to step down care. You're stable. You're going to be fine." He nodded, and she squeezed his shoulder once, a gesture that carried more weight than her words, the kind of contact that said, "I have been where you are. I know fear. I know how to survive it." She didn't look at Dr. Mercer as she walked past him. The conference room smelled like furniture polish and the particular sterile tension of institutional power. Linda Chen from Human Resources sat at the head of a table that stretched like a runway, and Dr. Mercer occupied a chair 3 seats down, his laptop open, his fingers steepled together in an expression of barely contained satisfaction. Ashley sat with her hands folded on the table, her face a mask of professional neutrality. Her nails had bitten crescents into her palms again, but nobody could see that from across the table. Reckless endangerment of patients and staff, Linda read from a tablet, her voice carrying the rehearsed tone of someone reading from a script someone else had written. Performing advanced procedures without physician authorization. Creating a hostage negotiation situation without proper training or de-escalation certification. She looked up. "We're placing you on immediate administrative leave pending investigation by the State Licensing Board." Ashley didn't move. Didn't blink. Didn't let the smallest crack appear in the surface. Dr. Mercer leaned back in his chair with the kind of satisfaction that made his whole spine relax. "For what it's worth," he said, his voice dripping with false concern the way oil slicks water, "I've also contacted your previous employers. Your employment history is surprisingly sparse for someone your age. Some gaps. Some irregularities that will need clarification." That was the real threat. Not the administrative leave, that was theater. The real threat was the private investigator he kept on retainer, the one who was already pulling sealed records, following a trail that led backward to a military unit designation that shouldn't appear in any civilian database, to an operation that had been officially classified then burned, to a woman who had been ordered to disappear and never surface again. Ashley's badge and access card slid across the table toward her. She picked them up and stood, her movements economical and controlled. She didn't look at Dr. Mercer. She didn't acknowledge his victory or his threat or the fact that he'd just set into motion the exact sequence of events that would destroy his entire career. She simply turned and walked out of the conference room, through the hallway that had become unfamiliar, past the security desk where a guard she recognized looked away in embarrassment, and out into the Norfolk evening where the sun was already beginning to sink. The diner on Military Highway was the kind of place that served the same waitress at 3 a.m. that it served at 7 a.m., the kind of place where nobody asked questions about a woman sitting alone in a booth with a folded flag on the table beside a cold cup of coffee. Ashley had driven this exact route 5 years ago when she first arrived in Norfolk, a ghost who'd been ordered to stay dead, a captain who'd been demoted to civilian and told to forget everything she'd been. She stared at her reflection in the window glass. A hollow-eyed woman in scrubs. Someone's abandoned daughter, her military records erased by people who decided she was too much of a liability to acknowledge. The flag was from Sergeant Michael Torres, or it had been his once, before he became a burn victim in ICU with her call sign tattooed on his arm, before the military decided that admitting he'd been saved by someone officially dead would complicate the narrative. At 3:16 a.m., her phone buzzed. A text from the ICU night nurse, the one who'd called her down to the burn unit 6 months ago to stand by a bed and stare at a name she thought had been buried. "Your patient Webb is awake and asking for Phoenix." She sat very still. Her phone buzzed again. Then again. The messages coming in like incoming fire. Marcus Webb is conscious. He's asking who helped him. He's telling the staff someone named Phoenix saved him. A retired Marine visiting his brother heard the name. He's asking questions. He knows something. The waitress refilled her coffee. Ashley didn't drink it. At 4:15 a.m., her phone rang. The voice on the other end was someone she didn't recognize, someone with the careful, measured tone of a federal agent. Captain Cooper? This is Special Agent Harrison with the Pentagon Liaison Office. We need to talk about what happened at St. Michael's Hospital today. And we need you to know that your background investigation request from your employer has triggered some federal oversight protocols. There are some billing irregularities we'd like to discuss with Dr. Marcus Mercer. We think you might want to be present for that conversation. Sometimes the bravest warriors carry stethoscopes, not guns. 2 days. That's how long Marcus Webb's eyes remained closed while Dr. Mercer stood before the hospital board with a presentation on his laptop, the glow reflecting off his smugly pressed suit as he clicked through slides about reckless unilateral decisions and dangerous cowboy medicine. His voice moved like honey, smooth, convincing, deadly. He was describing how Ashley's emergency needle decompression violated protocol, how she'd acted without supervision, how the state licensing board needed to examine her credentials more closely. The board members nodded, made notes, exchanged looks of concern. Mercer had them. He always got them. Then Marcus Webb woke. The nurse monitoring his vitals noticed first, the eyes moving beneath closed lids, the fingers twitching on the blanket. She called the ICU resident. Within minutes, Marcus's eyes opened, glassy and unfocused at first, then gradually sharpening as consciousness reassembled itself from fragments. His brain had survived the blast. Scarred, damaged, but functional. The medical team began their assessments, checking pupils, testing responsiveness, documenting the miracle of neurological recovery against all probability. It was routine protocol. Nobody expected what would happen in the next 90 seconds. The orderlies wheeled his bed past the board conference room just as Mercer finished his closing remarks. The room's glass walls framed him perfectly, posture erect, confidence radiating like heat off asphalt, his pointer still raised toward a slide that read clinical judgment failure. Ashley stood outside the glass, her badge gone, her access card surrendered, visible only to those who looked directly at her. Most people didn't. Marcus Webb did. His head turned. His damaged brain recognized something across the neural pathways that should have been destroyed, firing synapses that had no right to fire. And his lips moved, cracked and barely audible after 2 days of unconsciousness, whispering a single word that hung in the hallway like a bullet suspended in slow motion, Phoenix. The orderlies heard it. The ICU nurse heard it. And somehow, impossibly, everyone in the conference room went completely motionless, as if they'd heard it too. An older Marine, silver-haired, weathered face that belonged in a recruitment poster from 30 years ago, stood at the nurse's station filling out discharge paperwork for his brother. He froze. The pen in his hand stopped moving. His jaw tightened. He set the paperwork down with movement slow and deliberate as a man defusing explosives, then pulled out his phone with fingers that trembled slightly. Not fear. Recognition. The kind of trembling that comes from holding something sacred. He scrolled through his notes, found what he was looking for, and began reading aloud. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried the weight of ceremonies and formations and 21-gun salutes. The words moved through the hallway like a command, Silver Star citation. Captain Ashley Cooper. For actions in Ramadi, Anbar Province. While conducting operations in the Jolin district on November 14, 2008, Captain Cooper demonstrated extraordinary heroism under fire. Despite intense enemy engagement, she repeatedly exposed herself to hostile fire to evacuate wounded personnel and coordinate air support. Her action saved the lives of 14 service members. He paused. His voice shifted, becoming something harder. In recognition of gallantry in action against an armed enemy. The conference room door was open. Every word entered like shrapnel. Mercer's face underwent a transformation visible from the hallway, the color draining away, the confidence collapsing like a structure losing its foundation. The board members turned toward the open door, toward the sound of that citation, toward Ashley standing motionless in the hallway with her reinstatement letter still in the envelope. What happened next took exactly 45 seconds. A black sedan pulled up to the main entrance. The kind of sedan that moves through cities with government plates nobody questions. The doors opened with the precision of a military formation, and a retired general stepped out, United States Army, medals across his chest like a conversation in decorations, movements precise as a surgical strike. He was 73 years old and moved like he could still run 5 miles in combat boots. He walked through the automatic doors. He walked past the main desk without checking in. He walked directly to the ICU, found Marcus Webb's room, confirmed the patient ID with his own eyes, then asked for Captain Cooper. The ICU nurse pointed toward the conference room hallway, her hand shaking slightly. The general found Ashley exactly where she'd been standing. He stopped 3 feet away, brought himself to a position of attention with his heels together, and rendered a full military salute, fist to chest, a gesture reserved for superior officers and the fallen and those who've earned respect through means most civilians would never understand. He held that salute for 4 seconds. 5. 6. Then he dropped his hand and said, "Captain." General Holland. Ramadi was 15 years ago, but I remember every person on that roster. I came as soon as I heard your name was in the system. Mercer emerged from the conference room. His mouth opened to interrupt, to bluster, to reassert authority, but Holland's presence had already shifted something fundamental in the air. The general turned slightly, acknowledging Mercer's existence with the kind of attention one gives to an insect on a windshield. "Dr. Mercer, your time is finished here." It wasn't a request. The Pentagon liaison arrived at 2:15 p.m. that afternoon in a suit that cost more than most people's cars, carrying a leather briefcase and the kind of composure that comes from working in spaces where real power operates without raising its voice. She sat in the hospital administrator's office and delivered facts in clipped, official tones that made the 2 board members present go pale, their hands moving to their water glasses as if they'd suddenly forgotten how to breathe normally. Captain Ashley Elizabeth Cooper. Security clearance level TS-SCI with polygraph. Codename designation, Phoenix. Unit assignment, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, 2nd Platoon. Deployed for tours of duty. Citations, Silver Star, Bronze Star with Valor, 2 Purple Hearts. Official record status, sealed by order of JSOC Director. Background investigation into Captain Cooper is suspended effective immediately. She paused, opened her briefcase, removed a single photograph, Ashley in combat uniform, younger, harder, standing with 14 other soldiers in a desert that had no mercy. The flag the captain carried off that objective in 2008 is still in her possession, I believe. That flag represents 14 people who are alive today because she walked into a situation where walking away was statistically the rational choice. The administrator couldn't speak. His mouth moved. Nothing emerged. The liaison continued, her voice never changing. Register, Dr. James Mercer will be contacted separately regarding flag transactions in his billing records. The federal auditors are in your basement right now examining 5 years of procedural documentation. They found the pattern in 47 minutes. Unnecessary catheterizations. Phantom consultations. Kickback arrangements with medical supply vendors. She stood. Closed her briefcase. Captain Cooper's reinstatement is effective immediately. The hospital will apologize in writing and restore her full compensation for the period of suspension. You will also draft an apology from Dr. Mercer. If he refuses, the investigators will understand that as evidence of consciousness of guilt. The wheels of institutional investigation move differently than the wheels of justice, but they grind finer. The federal auditors working in the hospital basement pulled 5 years of billing records, compared Dr. Mercer's procedure logs against insurance claims against patient outcomes, and found the pattern immediately. Unnecessary cardiac catheterizations that generated $47,000 per procedure. Phantom consultations billed to surgical cases he'd never actually participated in. Medical supply orders from vendors that appeared on incorporation papers under his wife's maiden name, a shell company with no legitimate business purpose. The numbers accumulated like a confession: $3,780,000 in fraudulent claims. The hospital board suspended his privileges within 24 hours. The cardiology practice voted to dissolve his partnership. The medical board opened a state investigation that moved with the swift brutality reserved for physicians who made all their colleagues look complicit by association. Dr. Mercer sat in his lake house, the one purchased with fraud proceeds, the 6-bedroom colonial overlooking water that would soon belong to the government, and watched his attorney's emails pile up with subject lines that deteriorated from discussing options to immediate concerns to strongly recommend settlement discussion. His wife stopped answering his calls. The news broke on Norfolk local channels on a Wednesday evening: prominent cardiologist under investigation for insurance fraud. By Friday, his medical license was suspended pending review. By the following Tuesday, his assets were frozen pending civil forfeiture. The plea agreement materialized like a ghost from a legal grave: surrender his license permanently, repay $3.2 million, avoid felony charges if he cooperated with federal investigators. His attorney negotiated the final reduction in status like a man haggling over the price of his former life. The punishment was baroque in its specificity. Mercer would teach CPR certification courses at Tidewater Community College for $18 an hour. $180 per day. $4,500 per month. Once a prominent cardiologist with a lake house and tailored suits and the power to destroy careers. Now minimum wage, high school gymnasium, bored teenagers watching him demonstrate chest compressions on a rubber dummy. 3 weeks later, the hospital issued its formal statement. Captain Ashley Cooper's administrative suspension was rescinded immediately. Full back pay would be restored. A written apology was prepared and signed by the board chairman, expressing regret for the administrative error in her treatment. The letter also mentioned a newly created position, trauma response coordination, if the captain was interested in developing protocols for emergency situations requiring rapid physician response. The morning light broke over St. Michael's Hospital parking lot in shades of pink and gold that belonged in Renaissance paintings. The Chesapeake Bay was visible in the distance, the water still and mirror-smooth, catching the sunrise like a reflection of possibility. Ashley stood beside her car in scrubs printed with tiny medical symbols, holding 2 items, the reinstatement letter in her left hand, the folded flag in her right. The flag had been folded by military hands in 2008, wrapped around something sacred that no longer breathed. Her weapon sergeant. Marodi. The first person she'd carried after the blast. She'd kept it hidden for 15 years, never showing it, never explaining it, just knowing it was there like a heartbeat beneath her ribs. Across the parking lot, Dr. Mercer loaded cardboard boxes into a decade-old sedan, the kind of car driven by people who'd lost everything that mattered. His expensive vehicle was already seized. His house was in federal lockdown. The suit he wore was wrinkled now, pulled from a box instead of pressed by professional hands. His movements were mechanical, defeated, his shoulders curved inward as if the weight of his future had somehow become physical. He didn't see her watching. Ashley allowed herself the smallest smile, not triumphant, just satisfied in the way of soldiers who completed their mission and made it back alive. The mask she'd worn for 5 years, the one that bent her shoulders and kept her voice soft and accepted insults without flinching, could ease slightly now, though never fully drop. That mask had become part of her face. The armor and the person had fused. But she could loosen it just enough to remember what she'd been before it was necessary. She visited the ICU before her first shift back. Michael Torres, the burn victim with her name tattooed on his forearm, had regained consciousness. His eyes held something broken. The traumatic brain injury had erased Ramadi, erased Phoenix, erased everything except the ink on his skin and a vague sense of someone important. His uncle, General Holland, sat beside the bed telling stories that would have to do the remembering for both of them. The general turned as Ashley entered. He didn't salute this time. That ceremony had been completed. Instead, he simply nodded, the kind of acknowledgement men exchange when they've seen the same terrible things and survived them anyway. In the ER, Ashley pinned her badge back on and found her locker exactly as she'd left it, except for one new addition, a shadow box containing her silver star, no longer hidden, mounted where she could see it between shifts. Someone had installed it. Someone had known. She walked into the ER for night shift at 7:56 p.m., stethoscope around her neck, moving with quiet confidence through automatic doors that opened like they'd been waiting for her return. The staff moved differently around her now, not with deference exactly, but with the kind of awareness people develop when they realize they've been standing next to something dangerous and protective at the same time. That was the last time anyone at St. Michael's called her just a nurse. If you've watched this far, you already know that the quietest person in the room might just be the most important one. Sometimes the bravest warriors carry stethoscopes, not guns. Like and subscribe for more stories about people who walk toward the darkness instead of away from it.